Magic Tree House, Book Number 37. A Merlin Mission. Dragon of the Red Dawn. Chapter 6. The Banana Tree. "This is your castle?" said Jack. Basho smiled. "In my heart, my humble cottage is grander than all the castles of the samurai," he explained. "And my banana tree is more beautiful to me than all the beauty of the imperial garden." Jack and Danny stared at the large plant with the long, droopy leaves. "I like this tree so much I have taken my name from it," said Basho. Basho means banana tree. "Cool," said Annie. She looked around. "It's nice here." "Not really," thought Jack. The cottage was shabby, and the droopy banana tree looked scrawny and sad to him. "Please come inside," said Basho. He slipped off his sandals and left them outside. He picked up a bundle of wood, then ducked through the low door that led into his hut. Jack and Danny took off their shoes too, and followed Basho into a small, shadowy room. Basho opened his shutters to let in the evening air. "Please sit," he said. "Thank you," said Jack and Danny. Jack looked around the room for chairs, but there weren't any. The only furniture was a low wooden table and a bamboo chest. 3 straw mats covered the earthen floor. Jack and Danny sat down on one of the mats. Basho lit a small oil lamp. Then he made a fire in his fireplace. "I will prepare tea for us," he said. "Rest while I draw water from the river." He picked up one of the 2 wooden buckets near the door and headed outside. When Basho was gone, Jack and Danny looked at each other. "I guess this is a 3-mat house," said Annie. Jack nodded. "You'd think a famous teacher of the samurai would have a 100-mat house, or at least a 50-mat house," he said. "I like this house, though," said Annie. "It's cozy." "I wonder who Basho is exactly," said Jack. "If he's famous, maybe he's in our book," said Annie. "Look him up." "Good idea," said Jack. He pulled the research book out of his bag. By the light of the crackling fire, he looked up Basho in the index. "He is here!" Jack turned to the right page and read aloud. Basho is one of Japan's greatest poets. He wrote short, beautiful poems that speak to people as clearly today as they did during the Edo period of Japan. "Basho's a great poet," said Annie. "That explains everything." "Sort of," said Jack. "It explains why we had to recite poems to the samurai, but it doesn't explain why Basho lives in such a dinky house." Basho opened the door and came in with his bucket. Jack closed the book and slipped it back into his bag. Basho poured river water into an iron pot over the fire. He pulled 3 tiny bowls and a small cloth bag from the bamboo chest. He took loose green tea from the bag and dropped it into the bowls. Then he waited patiently for the water to boil. Jack and Danny waited patiently too. Listening to the soft rushing sounds of the river outside, Jack started to feel peaceful for the first time all day. When the water was hot, Basho poured some into each of the tea bowls. Then he handed the warm bowls to Jack and Annie. "Thank you," said Annie. "Thank you," said Jack. "You are welcome," said Basho. Jack carefully took a sip from the steaming bowl. The green tea tasted bitter, but he didn't mind it. Interesting taste," said Annie. "Basho, Jack was wondering, if you're a famous poet, why do you live in such a dinky house?" "Annie," said Jack, embarrassed. "She's kidding. I wasn't really wondering that." Basho laughed. "Long ago I trained to be a samurai," he said. "But I was not happy. All I wanted to do was write poetry. A poet does not need to live in a castle. A poet needs to live with the wind and the clouds, the flowers and the birds. Here I have a small garden and my banana tree. I have the sound of the river all day long. Here I have everything I need to write my poems." "What do you write about?" asked Danny. "Small things," said Basho. "A crow picking snails out of the mud, A woodpecker hammering a tree, pine needles scattered by the wind. A poet finds beauty in all the small things of nature. And you teach poetry to the samurai? Asked Jack. Yes, the samurai greatly honor the art of poetry, said Basho. Poetry helps focus the mind. The samurai believe a truly brave warrior should be able to compose a poem even in the midst of an earthquake or while facing an enemy on the battlefield. Can you say one of your poems for us? Asked Annie. Let me think, said Basho. Well, I was working on a new poem yesterday. He reached for a wooden box under the table. He took a small piece of delicate paper from the box and read aloud. An old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. Basho looked up at Jack and Annie. Said Jack. Nice beginning. It is not just the beginning, said Basho. It is the whole poem, a small moment in time. I think it's great, said Annie. I love frogs. Your poem makes me love them even more. Would you read it again, please? Jack said. He felt like he must have missed something. Basho read again. An old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. Jack nodded thoughtfully. Good, he said. It's really good, and he meant it. The poem made him feel as if he himself had been right there by that pond, hearing the frog splash into the water, breaking the silence. If you like it, you may have it, said Basho. He handed the paper to Jack. Thanks, said Jack. As he put the poem in his bag, a bell rang softly in the distance. Ah, the temple bells, said Basho. He stood up. It is time to rest. I will take a mat and sleep outside. I enjoy sleeping under the stars. And now, because of the poem you recited today, Annie, I shall think of them as diamonds in the sky. Annie smiled. You can stay inside and cover yourselves with these mosquito nets, said Basho. He pulled some nets from the bamboo chest and handed them to Jack and Annie. But do not worry. In my small house there are only small mosquitoes, not giant ones like those in the imperial palace. Jack and Annie laughed at Basho's joke. He gave a net to each of them. Then he picked up one of the mats from the floor and pulled it outside, closing the door behind him. The fire in the fireplace had died down. The light from the oil lamp had nearly gone out too. Jack and Annie lay on the straw mats and covered themselves with the mosquito nets. A cricket chirped on the hearth. Jack noticed a patch of light on the floor. He realized it was moonlight coming through the open window. Jack reached out from under the net and put his hand on the square of pale moonlight. He could hear the rustling of the banana plant in the breeze. Half asleep, he imagined himself swaying with its long, broad leaves. This dinky hut is much nicer than a castle, Annie murmured. I feel like we're tiny crickets going to sleep. Yeah, I feel like I'm holding moonlight in my hand, said Jack, and like I'm a banana leaf dancing in the wind. Sounds like a poem, said Annie. Yeah, maybe I should write it down, said Jack. But instead, he fell fast asleep. Chapter 7. Clang, clang, clang. Clang, clang, clang. Jack opened his eyes. The sound of bells filled the night. Not the gentle ringing of the temple bells, but a harsh clanging. Jack smelled smoke. He and Danny threw off their mosquito nets and stumbled to the door. Basho was standing in his yard, looking at the dawn sky. It was black with smoke. The bells kept clanging. Is there a fire? Asked Jack. Yes, said Basho. It must be very big, for the bells do not stop ringing from the watchtower. This is what we have feared most. I must go and help the firefighters. We'll help too, said Jack. No, stay here, said Basho. He pulled on his socks and sandals, then grabbed a wooden bucket by the door. If the fire gets close, wade into the river, where you will be safe. But we want to help, said Annie. Yes, wait for us, said Jack. He and Annie pulled on their socks and sandals. Come then, said Basho. But if the fire begins to spread, you must promise to return here to the river. We promise, said Annie. Then bring the other bucket and follow me, said Basho. I'll get it, said Jack. He hurried into the hut and grabbed the wooden bucket by the hearth. It was heavy, even without water in it. Jack hugged the bucket to his chest and rushed back outside. Jack and Annie followed Basho through the pine forest. They passed a farmhouse where two small children stood outside, looking at the flowery sky. Our father says the lumberyard near the river is burning, the boy shouted to Basho. He has gone to help fight the fire, said the girl. Great piles of wood are burning. The fire bells kept clanging as Basho, Jack, and Annie rushed past the temple and across the narrow footbridge. They hurried up the winding dirt path until they came to the shopping market. In the smoky red dawn, people were pushing carts piled high with goods. They were running away from the fire. But Basho, Jack, and Annie ran toward the fire. The air grew hotter and smokier near the tea houses and the performance stages. Sparks flew through the sky. Tiles and rooftops were catching fire and crashing to the ground. Basho led Jack and Annie farther through the smoke until they came to the lumberyard. The fire roared as it burned piles of logs. Flames rose high into the sky. Firefighters were passing buckets of water up a line from the river to the fire. Others waved huge fans to beat back the wind-blown flames, while the most daring worked with hooks and axes, trying to separate the burning timber. Help the bucket brigade, Basho said to Jack and Annie. Get water from the river. Basho rushed to help the men beating back the fire with fans, while Jack and Annie hurried down to the river. Jack filled their wooden bucket. With water inside, it was so heavy he couldn't lift it. Do it together, said Annie. Right, said Jack. Using all their strength, Jack and Annie carried their bucket up the bank of the river. As they stumbled along, they tried not to spill the water. Jack could hardly breathe in the smoke-filled air. His throat and eyes burned. His face felt red hot. Finally, when he thought he couldn't take another step, they got to the bucket brigade. They gave their bucket to the person at the end, who gave them an empty bucket. Get more, he said. Jack and Annie hurried back to the river with the empty bucket. He filled it with water and then struggled back up the bank. Over and over, Jack and Annie hauled buckets of water back and forth from the river to the line of firefighters. Everyone worked hard to battle the great blaze, but the flames kept shooting into the sky. Eventually, the fire leapt over the river, and timber on the far bank began to burn. Oh no, cried a woman. All of Edo will catch fire now. The rice storage houses will burn down, said a man. The harvest will be destroyed. Several people began weeping. Jack felt like crying too. Right in front of his eyes, the beautiful floating world of Edo was about to go up in flames. This is hopeless, he said to Annie. No, it's not, Annie said. The wand. We can use the wand. Of course, cried Jack. But it's in my bag, back at Basho's house. We have to get it, said Annie. She shouted to Basho. Basho, we're going back to your castle. Yes, run for safety, called Basho. Jump into the river. Right, cried Jack. Be careful, Annie shouted to Basho. Then she and Jack started running as fast as they could. They raced past the market. They ran across the footbridge, past the temple and the farmhouse, and through the grove of pines to Basho's house. Jack and Annie ran inside the tiny hut. Jack grabbed his bag and pulled out the wand. He waved it through the air. Do something to make the fire stop, he shouted. Jack held his breath and waited. Let me try, said Annie. She took the wand and waved it. Stop the fire over Edo now, she shouted. Jack and Annie waited again. It's not working, cried Jack. We must be doing something wrong. But this is for the good of everyone, said Annie. I know, said Jack. And we've tried our hardest, said Annie. Everybody has. 5 words, said Jack. We have to use 5 words. Oh, right, said Annie. She waved the wand through the air again. Put out the fire, she yelled. One more word, cried Jack. Please, shouted Annie. Jack and Annie were blasted by a blinding light. Jack felt himself shooting through brightness, then darkness, then back into light. An icy wind blew. The air was crystal clear. Early sunlight flashed on rock. Jack and Annie were standing on the ledge of a mountain. Chapter 8. In the Red Dawn. Are you okay? Annie asked Jack. She was still holding the wand. Her pigtails blew in the bright wind. Yeah, but what happened? Said Jack in a daze. He was freezing and out of breath. Where are we? I don't know, whispered Annie. Jack shielded his eyes from the brilliant light of the red dawn and looked around. Pink clouds floated through the air like piles of cotton candy. Through a gap in the clouds, he saw hills shrouded in black smoke below. Beneath the smoke, flames rose from the city of Edo. I think we're on Mount Fuji, said Annie. Mount Fuji? Said Jack. That's crazy. Why are we here? He stopped to catch his breath. He felt dizzy and lightheaded. Edo's burning. We should be there. Maybe the wand didn't understand, said Annie. Maybe it was trying to save us by taking us far away from the fire. Suddenly, a great mass of thick clouds piled up, ringing the mountaintop like a wall. The clouds whirled and tumbled. They changed color, from rose to gold to gray to white. What's going on? Cried Jack. The head of a gigantic monster rose from the bubbling clouds. Ah! Jack and Annie screamed. They grabbed each other and crouched down on the rocky ledge. The monster had spiky eyebrows and long, curled whiskers. It had the horns of a deer, the forked tongue of a snake, and the fiery breath of a dragon. Through the swirling clouds, Jack and Annie could see the dragon's snake-like body curling through the clouds and down the mountainside. Its back was covered with shiny scales. Its spine had a row of shark-like fins. The dragon reached out its claws. They were like the claws of an eagle, only 1,000 times bigger. The claws gripped the side of the mountain. Jack made himself as small as he could. He covered his head, but Annie jumped to her feet. I get it, she cried. I know what's happening. Thank you for coming. Annie, get down, Jack shouted. Jack, it's the cloud dragon, said Annie. The puppet show, remember? The wand sent her here. What? Why? Cried Jack. She makes rain. Don't you remember? Rain, cried Annie. She commands the rain clouds. The dragon lowered her giant head, stretching it over the mountain ledge. Her scales glittered honey gold in the dawn light. She was still, very still, as if she were waiting for something. Come on, we have to climb on her back, shouted Annie. Why? Cried Jack. We have to go with her, said Annie. The wand brought us to the dragon. Now it's up to us to show her what to do. Okay, said Jack. Annie climbed onto the back of the cloud dragon. She sat between two of the dragon's shark-like fins. Jack climbed on behind her. He gripped the fin in front of him as if he were holding on to the horn of a saddle. Fly over the fire, yelled Annie. Make rain. Lots of it, shouted Jack. The cloud dragon slid off the mountain ledge. Jack trembled with cold as the monster slithered through the freezing sea of clouds like a snake through the grass. Above Edo, Jack looked down. Billowing black smoke and red flames shot into the dawn sky. Now, rain now, Jack said. The cloud dragon reared back her head. Great black clouds flowed from her mouth. The clouds spread across the sky. There was a crack of thunder and a flash of lightning. Then rain began to pour down on the city. The dragon twisted her head this way and that. More clouds blew from her mouth, and more rain fell on the burning city of Edo. As the dragon slithered through the sky, breathing out mountains of storm clouds, rain fell on the flat lands of the rice fields, on the imperial garden, the samurai castles, the fish market, and the great bridge. Rain fell on the floating world of inns and stations, tea houses, temples, and farms. Rain fell on the lumber yard and the pine forest and the canals. Slowly, the rain washed away all the smoke and flames. Even after the fires of Edo no longer flickered, the cloud dragon breathed more black clouds, and the rain kept falling steadily, soaking the gardens and fields, filling the shallow rivers and dried-up ponds. "The fire's out," Jack shouted. "Take us to Basho's," Anna yelled to the dragon. The cloud dragon twisted her giant body. She slid through the dark clouds. Then she reared up until Jack and Danny couldn't hold on any longer, and they were falling backward, somersaulting through the air. Splash! Splash! Jack sank to the bottom of the river. He flailed his arms and struggled to the surface. His head bobbed up. He spewed out water and gasped for air. He had lost his glasses. He dove back down and grabbed them from the river bottom, then swam back to the surface. Treating water, he wiped his glasses, then put them on. "Hi!" Annie yelled. She was holding the wand in the air, above the water. "Hi!" Jack yelled back. Jack and Danny swam toward the bank of the river. They swam until their feet could touch bottom. Then they dragged themselves out of the water and collapsed on the muddy bank. They had lost their socks and sandals. Their silk kimonos clung to their bodies. Dripping wet, they gasped for breath and looked up at the sky. Big drops of rain splashed on their faces. There was no sign of the cloud dragon, but the cool rain kept falling, bathing the floating world of Edo. Chapter 9. Flowers of Edo. "We did it," said Annie. "We made our own magic." "Yeah, we got the cloud dragon to put out the fire," breathed Jack. He felt dazed. "Do you think we're near Basho's house?" "I think so," said Annie. "We asked the cloud dragon to take us there, so I bet she did. Come on, let's find Basho." Jack and Danny stood up and started walking along the edge of the river. They walked barefoot through the mud, under dripping trees. "Hey, there's the clearing," said Annie. Jack and Danny headed toward the clearing beyond the trees and tall grass. "Oh no!" cried Annie. "Look!" In the clearing, rain was falling on the charred ruins of Basho's house. The shingled roof and the bamboo walls of the little hut had burned and collapsed. "Where's Basho?" said Jack, scared. "There," said Annie. The famous poet sat on a log next to his banana tree in the gray rain. His clothes were blackened. His face was covered with soot. He clutched his writing box. "Basho!" yelled Annie. Basho looked up. A smile crossed his dirty, weathered face. "I looked for you by the river, but didn't see you," he said. "I am glad you were safe." "We're glad you're safe too," said Jack. "But your castle burned down," said Annie. "Yes, it burned before the miracle of the rain," said Basho, sighing. Jack and Danny sat on the log next to him. Through the smoky drizzle, they all stared at the rubble. Trees and plants dripped with rain. A pigeon cooed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Annie broke the silence. "I'm glad you still have your banana tree," she said. "I like the sound of the rain falling on the leaves." Basho looked up, but didn't say anything. "Yeah, and I like the sound of the river," said Jack. "It's louder now since the rain came." Basho tilted his head as if listening to the rain on the leaves of the banana plant and to the steady rushing sounds of the river. His face softened. Yes, I like those things too, he said. He held up his wooden box. And I still have my poems. Don't worry, Basho, said Annie. Everything can be built again. And your castle will be even more beautiful than before, said Jack. Basho smiled. I suppose that is why the ancients called our fires the Flowers of Edo, he said. What do you mean? Asked Jack. After something is destroyed by a fire, a good new thing often takes its place, said Basho. Just as after the bleakest winter, beautiful flowers return with the spring. I'm sure you'll make many beautiful flowers, said Annie. Thank you, said Basho. I am sorry, though, that you and Jack will not have a place to stay now. Don't worry, said Annie. We have to travel back to our own house. How far away is that? Asked Basho. Very far, said Annie. She and Jack stood up. But we just need to get back to the Imperial Garden. We'll know the way from there. Good, said Basho. He stood up. Come, I will accompany you back to the garden. Thanks, that would be great, said Jack. Basho picked up his walking stick. Then he led Jack and Danny along the bank of the river. Through the light drizzle, they saw a ferry boat moving upstream. Basho waved, and the pilot steered the boat to shore. Jack and Danny followed Basho onto the ferry. The three of them sat together on a wooden bench. The other passengers stared at them. Many had ashes on their clothes and soot on their faces. Jack was relieved to see that no samurai were on board. Greetings, Master Basho, the pilot said. The other passengers nodded respectfully to Basho. They smiled as if the presence of the great poet gave them hope. The rains were a miracle, were they not, Master Basho? An old woman said. Indeed they were, said Basho. I guess the cloud dragon showed up just in time, said Annie. Annie, whispered Jack. Basho smiled at her. I am afraid no one believes in the cloud dragon anymore, Annie, he said. But it is lovely to pretend, is it not? Yes, it is lovely, said Annie. The rain stopped as the ferry boat traveled on up the river. Mist rose from the water, and birds began to sing. When they passed the tea houses, Jack and Annie saw firefighters cleaning up after the fire, sweeping up broken tiles and scrubbing the walkways. Waiters were bringing them tea. The sun was shining by the time they passed the puppet stage and the charred lumberyard. Wisps of smoke still rose from the black piles of burned logs. The ferry boat floated on through the bright morning. It glided under the great bridge and past the crowded fish market. Fishermen were hauling in their catch from the night before. By the time they moved past the samurai castles and came near the moat of the Imperial Garden, the sun had completely dried out Jack and Danny's kimonos. The boat pulled up to the landing. Basho helped Jack and Danny onto the dock. He waved goodbye to the boat passengers. Jack, Annie, and Basho walked over the stone bridge that crossed the moat. They walked through the massive gate in the high wall. Then they followed the paths of the Imperial Garden, around the big rocks in the pond with the swans. Jack kept an eye out for horses and samurai warriors, but the garden was as peaceful as when they had first landed. It was filled with birdsong. The willow swayed. Water from the waterfall tumbled into the green pool. Jack caught sight of the sun shining on the treehouse, high in the cherry tree. Jack stopped walking. We know our way home from here, he said to Basho. Are you certain? Asked Basho. He did not seem to notice the treehouse and the cherry tree. We're sure, said Annie. Once we start on our way, the trip will be easy. Basho nodded. You remind me of the famous saying of the samurai Musashi, he said. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. I've heard that saying before, said Jack. Words can outlive their creators, said Basho, though I will never be so lucky as to have mine outlive me. Don't be too sure of that, said Annie. Basho gave them a little smile. I hope you both will return to Edo someday, he said. Look for me when you come back. I should have a lovely new castle on the river by then. Thanks, said Jack. Goodbye, said Annie. They both bowed to Basho. Basho bowed to them. Then the great poet turned and left them. Falling cherry blossoms floated on the wind as he walked away. Jack and Annie watched Basho until they could no longer see him. Then they turned to go. Just as they started walking, a man stepped out from the shadows of the garden. The man wore a blue coat and 2 swords hung from his belt. Excuse me, said the samurai. May I see your passports, please? Chapter 10. Journey of 1,000 miles. Jack couldn't speak. Our passports? Said Annie. They got destroyed in a fire on the other side of the great bridge. The samurai narrowed his eyes. Your passports burned? He said. Why were you on the other side of the great bridge? We were with Master Basho, said Jack. Master Basho? Said the samurai. Yes, said Annie. We are students of his. Ah! The samurai's expression brightened. So you study poetry with Master Basho? Yes, said Annie. Would you like to hear some poems? Oh, no, thought Jack. Not again. Yes, please, said the samurai. No problem. Annie thought for a moment and then said, Here's a simple little poem. She recited, Rain falls outside, but the tiny cricket on the hearth is dry tonight. The samurai nodded. He said. Yes, very simple, but very lovely. Thank you, said Annie. The man turned to Jack. Jack could hardly breathe. His mind was blank. He looked to Annie for help, but Annie just smiled, waiting to hear his poem. Jack cleared his throat. He tried to stay calm. He closed his eyes and let his mind roam over their visit to Japan. He closed his eyes. He looked up at the cloudless sky and said, The sun is shining, the day is hot, but moonlight and cool breezes still fill my heart, left over from last night. Whoa, whispered Annie. Good. Yes, very good, said the samurai. He looked at the sky, the moonlight, the cool breeze, he mused. Left over from the night. Very good. Master Basho has taught you well. The samurai strolled away, shaking his head and murmuring to himself. He let out a happy laugh, as if delighted with the day. Jack couldn't believe it. They were free. Hurry, let's go, he said, before someone else sees us. Jack and Annie ran to the rope ladder and started up. As soon as they climbed inside the treehouse, Jack grabbed the Pennsylvania book. He found a picture of the Frog Creek woods. As the famous samurai once said, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, said Jack. Or one sentence, said Annie. Right, said Jack. He pointed at the picture. I wish we could go home. Annie gasped. Wait a minute, she said. We forgot our mission. What? Said Jack. But the wind started to blow. The treehouse started to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still. Absolutely still. The early morning air was cold. Jack and Annie were back in Frog Creek, wearing their own clothes. Jack's burlap bag was a backpack again. He looked inside to make sure the wand of Dianthus was there. It was, and Basho's frog poem was there too. I can't believe it, said Annie. We didn't look for a secret of happiness from Marlin. How could we forget that? Oh, man, said Jack. We were so busy worrying about the samurai and putting out the fire that we forgot our mission. What will Morgan say? Said Annie. We've never forgotten a mission before, and this one was the most important we've ever had, to help save Merlin. Annie was near tears. Wait, calm down, said Jack. Let's think a minute. Maybe we actually found the secret of happiness. Maybe we just don't know we found it. You mean like we were extra happy at any time? Asked Annie. Yeah, sort of, said Jack. Were we? I don't know. Were you? Said Annie. I think a few times, said Jack. Like when? Said Annie. Like when we were crossing the Great Bridge with Basho. I felt sort of happy then, said Jack. Me too, said Annie. And I was pretty happy eating sushi. Yeah, but I got scared when I saw the samurai watching me, said Jack. What about the sumo wrestling match? Asked Annie. That was fun, said Jack, but I don't know if it really made me happy. Riding the dragon and putting out the fire? Said Annie. That was great, said Jack, but I was too worried about saving the city to be happy. Making up poems for the samurai? Said Annie. Too nervous, said Jack. Well, when were you purely happy? Said Annie. I think it was when... Jack stopped. He felt silly saying what he was about to say. Go ahead, said Annie. I think it was when I was lying on the mat in Basho's house, said Jack, and I touched that little patch of moonlight on the floor and I listened to the banana leaves in the wind. Oh, yes, said Annie. Before we fell asleep, I heard the cricket and I felt like I was the cricket myself going to sleep in a cozy place. Yeah, like that, said Jack. It's like what Basho said about finding beauty in the small things of nature, said Annie. Like his poem about that frog splashing in the water. I think that's it, said Jack. A secret of happiness is paying really close attention to the small things in nature. Wow, said Annie. I think that's a great secret to share with Merlin. It is, said Jack, and Basho's poem will help Merlin understand. Right, said Annie. Let's go, said Jack. Annie climbed down the rope ladder. Jack put his pack on his back and followed her. As Jack and Danny started through the chilly woods together, Jack noticed things he hadn't seen before. He saw tiny blue wildflowers sprouting up from the winter-weary ground. He saw fresh anthills in the dirt. He saw leaf buds on twigs and green moss in a rug, bright in the March sunlight. I feel like I'm seeing spring for the first time, said Jack. Me too, said Annie. Not just for the first time this year, said Jack, but for the first time in my whole life. Me too, said Annie. Jack felt happy, really happy, as he and Danny headed for home in the sparkling morning light.